Då har vi kommit till, jag tror det är den sista cameon idag. Så jag tänker vi läser klart oavsett hur lång tid det tar. Men först så skriver vi ner en bön och vi kanske får svar. Så, då börjar vi läsa och Cameo 32. Godis, eller God is. When Bill and Helen unexpectedly joined in the goal of demonstrating another way, it was as if that flipped on a power switch deep inside Helen. Abilities that had lain mostly dormant in her began to stir to life. At first, she began to have inner visions, and then somewhere in the same summer, in that same summer of 1965, she started to have psychic experiences. These experiences aroused considerable fear and anxiety in Helen. After being virtually obsessed with the search for God as a child, she had, as an adult, left religion and spirituality firmly behind, she says. I had shifted from agnosticism to angry atheism, having reached a point where mere mention of religion irritated me. I was heavily armed with scientific weapons, prepared and even eager to battle with ideas even remotely religious toned. Helen apparently saw the notion of psychic abilities as one of those religious toned ideas. It was as if psychic phenomena were a kind of gateway drug that could lead to the unwary into the most dangerous of addictions, the addiction to God. And yet, here she was, having her own undeniable experience with that gateway drug. How could that not lead to fear? Right alongside this fear, however, Helen had another very different reaction to her psychic episodes. I was actually becoming rather proud of the acquisition of such dramatic abilities, she said. And I even caught brief glimpses of fantasies of power and prestige crossing the back of my mind. This kind of egotism seemed to actually threaten to take hold of her newfound abilities. Some of the stories she reports convey this impression. For instance, when Bill went away on a trip to the Virgin Islands, Helen sent him a mental message to bring her back a Florentine gold pin, which he actually did. On another occasion, as she and Bill prepared for a business trip to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, she saw an inner picture of a Lutheran church. She was so sure this picture was genuine that she described it in writing, told Bill they would see it, and when they landed, and then that they would see it when they landed, and then when they didn't see it, dragged him around town in a taxi looking for it. She says, It had become outrageously important to me. On their way home, Bill did find a picture of her Lutheran church, but it had long ago been torn down, so that, ironically, the Mayo Clinic itself would be built. In both these episodes, and the one with the gold pin, while the abilities employed were out of the ordinary, the motives behind them clearly were not. And yet some of her psychic experiences had an entirely different quality. For example, once when she and Bill were working on a research paper, Helen suddenly put the paper down with great urgency said, "Quick, Bill, your friend Joe, the one we met in Chicago a while back, he is thinking about suicide. We must send him a message." Och jag måste säga det, i de här tidigare historierna, i den med kyrkan, så kontentan av vad som hände där blev att de kom i kontakt med en ung kvinna som behövde deras hjälp. Så det är lite grann samma som med Joe här, att syftet var inte ståhejet kring att hon hade sett en bild av en kyrka som de sen förstod hade stått där den här kliniken nu var byggd, utan det var att leda henne till den här kvinnan som de tog hand om och hjälpte sen. Kenneth Wapnick skriver om det i Abscess from Felicity. Jag tror att det är med i Carol House bok också, Remember to Laugh, som handlar om Bills liv. She then sent the silent message, "The answer is life, not death." That evening, Bill called Joe, who said he had been depressed and had actually picked up a gun that afternoon, but ended up putting it down. In another instance, on the way back from the Mayo Clinic visit, är det säkert den historien, and the desperate search for the Lutheran church she had seen in her mind, Helen put those same abilities to different use. She was able to psychically feel waves and waves of misery going through a young woman in the airport, even though the woman showed no outward signs of distress. Helen went over to talk to this woman, whose name was Charlotte, and learned that she was terrified of flying. So Helen and Bill then sat on either side of her on the plane, with Helen holding her hand. Charlotte, it turned out, was leaving her home and family to relocate to New York with just a few $100s in her pocket. Helen says she was a Lutheran, and she was sure all she had to do was to find a Lutheran church in New York, and they would take care of her there. Bill and I exchanged glances. The message was not hard to grasp. And this, I seemed to hear, is my true church, helping another, not the endifis you saw before. Jag vet inte vad det betyder, endifis. Det är en byggnad. Byggnaden som du såg tidigare, betyder det. During the little more than a week that Charlotte was in New York, Helen and Bill became her support system, helping her with everything. They thus ended up rendering a vital assistance to her at a crucial juncture in her life. With both Charlotte and Joe, the point of the story was not what an amazing ability Helen had. The point was that someone in crisis had received critical help just when he or she needed it. Here, then, was an entirely different way of seeing Helen's surprising gifts. Using them for a loving purpose was an alternative to both her feelings of pride and her feelings of fear. Jag upplever att det ofta är så med heliga andes vägledning, att jag först hamnar liksom i egots pendel. Här är det stolthet och rädsla som hon pendlar mellan. Men det kan ju vara positivt och negativt tänkande. Det kan vara vilka motsatser som helst som egot vill stoppa in mig i. Och så pendlar jag mellan de motsatserna. Framgång, misslyckande, kärlek, hat. Det kan vara vad som helst. Och det heliga ande visar alltid någonting där i mitten som lyfter mig upp över slagfältet. Och för Helen och Bill så var det ju, eller för Helen nu då i det här fallet, så var det ju att hjälpa andra som var meningen med alltihop. This point was not lost on Helen. The episode with Charlotte in particular helped shake her out of her fantasies of celebrity and bring her to her senses. She said of Charlotte, "I'm very grateful to her. I have an idea that I might never found that scroll without her help. It might well be that magic had to end in the plain facts of Charlotte before I could make the final decision to abandon magic in exchange for something much more desirable." In mentioning that scroll, Helen is referring to her key experience, which came sometime after the Mayo Clinic trip, in which she decided once and for all to abandon magic. My own magic phrase ended abruptly with a particular clear picture episode in which I knew I had made an irrevocable choice. I saw myself entering a cave cut into a rock formation on a bleak, windswept seacoast. All I found in the cave was a large and very old parchment scroll, papyrusrulle. Its ends were attached to heavily gold-tipped poles, and the scroll was wrapped around them so that they met in the middle of the scroll and were tied tightly together. With some difficulty, I managed to untie the ends and open the scroll just enough to reveal the center panel on which two words were written: God is. Then I unrolled the scroll all the way. As I did so, tiny letters began to appear on both sides of the panel. The silent voice, which I had heard before, explained the situation mentally to me. If you look at the left side, you will be able to read the past, said the voice. If you look at the right side, you will be able to read the future. The little letters on the sides of the panel were becoming clearer, but I hesitated only a moment before rolling up the scroll sufficiently to conceal everything except the center panel. I'm not interested in reading the past or the future, I said with finale. I just stop with this. The voice sounded both reassured and reassuring. You made it this time, it said. Thank you. And that, it seemed, was that. In this vision, then, Helen made an irrevocable choice to renounce the use of her abilities for purposes of the ego and devote them purely to God. With that decision, her preparation for being the scribe of A Course in Miracles was complete. While Helen knew this vision was pivotal, it was only a number of years later that she discovered that it may not have been entirely subjective. In the summer of 1973, she and Bill joined Ken Wapnick in Israel for 2 weeks and ended up visiting Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. Qumran is the ruin of an ancient community which was occupied at that time of Christ. Most scholars believe that the people who lived at Qumran were members of the Essenes, a Jewish sect dedicated to voluntarily poverty, communal living, and messianic expectations. The Dead Sea Scrolls were found in caves near the ruins of the community and appear to have been the library of the community. Och de här finns att läsa om man vill, eller det som finns kvar. Det finns lite olika varianter och det finns de som det är mycket kommentarer till. Sen finns det de som är ganska rena från kommentarer. Jag har läst några av dem och det är precis som en kurs i mirakler. Det är helt fantastiskt att läsa dem. Och det är samma sak med Nag Hammadi-fynden som också är sådana här papyrusrullar från den tiden just efter Jesus. Det är lite läckert att det är precis som en kurs i mirakler. Lite annorlunda ord och ett annat flöde, men man känner igen Jesus, man känner igen Kristus som talar till sig själv i de här texterna. Jag vet att Kenneth Wapnick var ute efter någonting helt annat och han hittade inte det han var ute efter, men att alla tre var väldigt fokuserade på det som hände nere i Israel där 1973. Ken Wapnick tells the story of Helen's visit to Qumran. Almost from the moment we arrived at Qumran, Helen was visibly moved, most uncharacteristic of her. As we stood on the site of the ancient community, we looked across the roped-off area to a series of caves, including the one where the scrolls were found in cylinders. At the same point, Helen burst into tears and told us that cave in front of her was the exact cave she had seen in her visions of the God is scroll. She then exclaimed that she was standing on the holiest place on earth. Turning around to look at the Dead Sea, not far from Qumran, Helen remarked that the water level was too low and that it should be considerably higher. Bill consulted his guidebook, and sure enough, it stated that 2,000 years ago, the water level had indeed been much higher. Helen and I then walked towards some of the ruins, and she told me of her strong impulse to walk over to the area which the Essenes had used as their cemetery. But then she felt an equally strong impulse from Jesus not to do so, hearing him say to her, "Let the dead bury the dead." Det här finns faktiskt i kursen. Låt de döda begrava de döda. And so Helen strayed away from what she almost certainly felt to be her own gravesite 1900 years ago. The implication is clear. When Helen had her vision of being on a bleak, wind-swept seacoast and entering a cave in which she found an ancient scroll, she may have been revisiting an actual past in which she lived by the bleak coast of the Dead Sea as part of a community that placed their scrolls in nearby caves. More specifically, the implication seems to be that in that life she had misused her abilities, and that in this vision she was traveling back to the point at which the error was made to make another choice with Jesus. The statement, "you made it this time," obviously suggests that there was another time where she had used her abilities to read the outer sides of the scroll, the past and the future. But this time she chose the central fact that God is. None of this can ever be proven, of course, yet it does fit nicely both with things that Jesus said to Helen and with things that we know about the Essenes and the Dead Sea Scrolls. To begin with, Jesus often called Helen his scribe, in a term that in this context referred to her ability to hear his voice and write down his words. This could potentially be echoed as a Camerian connection, since that community had a heavy scribal focus, in that many of the scrolls found there seem to have been produced by the community itself, perhaps in the room that one archaeologist called the scriptorium, because of ink wells found there. Jesus also referred to Helen's earlier misuse of very great scribal abilities. If we connect this with her scroll vision, it is possible that this earlier misuse consisted of a focus on physically reading the past and future. Psychologic måste det vara. Reading the past and the future as a member of the Qumran community. Interestingly, the Dead Sea Scrolls do contain a focus on prediction of the future. A number of the scrolls employ a method called pesher, in which the prophetic books of the Hebrew Bible, already centuries old by then, are tolkad by the commentator as making predictions about the community's life in the present and the impending end times. This means that among the Dead Sea Scrolls, there were actual scrolls that alternated between writing of the past and predictions of the future, somewhat reminiscent of the very scroll that Helen saw. According to the ancient historian Josephus, the Essenes were renowned for reading the future. There are also among them those who profess to foretell what is to come, being thoroughly trained in holy books. Various purifications and concise sayings of prophets, rarely, if ever, do they fail in their predictions. Indeed, Josephus tells 3 stories of successful predictions made by named Essenes seers. It may be, then, that Helen had been a seer in the very vein, a seer in this very vein. Whatever the case was, her scroll vision obviously suggests that reading the past and future was a mistaken use of her abilities. Why? The implication of the scroll is that God exists in the present. God is, not God was, or God will be. If Helen's focus was on reading past and future events, then all of her attention would be going to places where God could not be found. If, however, Helen could redirect her scribal abilities away from past and future and toward God in the present, then not only could she find God, but she could access spiritual wisdom that would enable others to find God. And compared to this greatest of all goals, finding out what happened in the past or what will happen in the future shrinks to insignificance. Given the importance of this vision for Helen's journey, it is not surprising that it found its way into the pages of the course. We find it in workbook lesson 169. Det gjorde vi bara för ett par dagar sedan. Oneness is simply the idea God is. And in his being, he encompasses all things. No mind holds anything but him. We say God is, and then we cease to speak. For in that knowledge, words are meaningless. There are no lips to speak them, and no part of mind sufficient, distinct to feel that it is now aware of something, not itself. And there are no lips to speak, and no part of mind sufficiently distinct to feel that it is now aware of something, not itself. It has united with its source. And like the source itself, it merely is. We cannot speak nor write nor even think of this at all. It comes to every mind when total recognition that it is its will is God's. Jag måste säga det igen. We cannot speak, nor write, nor even think of this at all. It comes to every mind when total recognition that its will is God's has been completely given and received completely. It returns the mind into the endless present, where the past and future cannot be conceived. It lies beyond salvation, past all thoughts of time, forgiveness, and the holy face of Christ. The Son of God has merely disappeared into his Father, as his Father has in him. The world has never been at all. Eternity remains a constant state. This passage expands the meaning of God is, taking it far beyond what is implied in the original vision. This expansion really rests on the second sentence, and in his being, he encompasses all things. This means that there are nothing actually outside of God isness, of God's isness. All that the above passage says rests on this single idea. We can picture this in terms of the imagery of Helen's vision. Imagine that once Helen rolled up the two sides of the scroll to conceal the past and the future, those two sides vanished, leaving the center panel free to expand and to ultimately encompass everything. Now, everything is inside of God's being. Everything abides with him in the endless present, where the past and the future cannot be conceived. This expansion of the center panel, given that it is limitless, must extend not just outward, but also forward to engulf the observer, the one who stands in front of the scroll. If God's being encompasses all things, then there cannot be a separate observer, a mind sufficiently distinct to feel what it is now aware of something not itself. The separate observer, like the two side panels, must ultimately vanish, that God may be all, in all. Thus, if we say God is, and truly understand what we are saying, then that is the last thing we will ever say. For we are now no longer a distinct mind that stands apart and speaks of what it sees. We have disappeared into our Father, into a state in which his being is our being, a state in which the world has never been, in which nothing has ever happened to interrupt eternity's constant state. A Course of Miracles is completely focused on the achievement of this one supreme goal. That is why it was so important for Helen not to let her ego take charge of her gifts and use them for impressive feats of predication. And that is undoubtedly why Jesus stopped Helen from trying to find what she believed to be her gravesite in the Qumran cemetery. As he says later in the Course, atonement might be equated with total escape from the past and total lack of interest in the future. We have an infinitely larger goal to attend to, and we have a smoother road to that goal, that with teachings and tools that were not available to us before, because Helen chose that center panel. Jag bara se. Nej, det är en till. Ja, men vi hinner läsa. Vi börjar på den. Men vill du säga någonting om God is?
Ja, det Helen går igenom här, det är ju det jag håller på med själv, alltihopa. Och jag har kommit till God is. That's it. No more, no less. Ja, det är intressant att sitta och lyssna, för jag ser ju liksom spår under hela den här filmen som jag har gått igenom. Hur det är. Mm. Så kommer jag inte ihåg, det var någonting jag tänkte på. Vad var det? Men det försvann såklart. Ja. Okej, tack.
Jag tänkte på, jag har haft ganska många sådana här paranormala upplevelser, men det var vid ett tillfälle då jag bodde nere på Bali i Indonesien, och så när svenskar kommer ner så brukar man hitta igen varandra. Så det var den äldre kvinna som kom ner, och hon visste att jag fanns där, så hon tog kontakt. Och hon måste ju ha varit kring 80 då. Men hon ville prata med mig, och hon sa att det var viktigt. Så vi träffades och då sa hon att hon visste att hon hade vandrat med Jesus. Och hon visste att jag hade vandrat med Jesus. Och hon var bara ett litet barn, men jag var äldre och jag var närmare Jesus. Men hon sa aldrig någonting mer om det. Men jag tänkte på det när jag läste det här. Och jag har också velat åka ner. Det är ju så oroligt där nere. Men jag har velat åka ner. Bara för att, jag vet inte, se om jag känner igen mig. Typ så. Jag känner så igen mig i Helens historia.
Mm.
Det är ju annorlunda men ändå likadant. Det var så konstigt det där. Att den här kvinnan, jag känner inte den här kvinnan. Men att hon ville komma i kontakt med mig. Jag hade det här budskapet. Men det har fascinerat mig. Det har fascinerat mig ända sedan jag var liten och gick i söndagsskola. Liksom. Det har ju en enorm dragningskraft. Annars så skulle jag inte sitta här. Skulle jag aldrig göra det arbete jag gör om det inte hade en sån enorm dragningskraft på mig.
Mm.
Mm.
Mm. Jag ser ju alltså, vad ska man säga, början på allting. Jag har inga ord, men alltså jag hade också såna här, jag gifte mig i USA, i San Pedro i Kalifornien. Och det var bara jag och min blivande man då, som vet om det här överhuvudtaget. Knappt våra föräldrar här hemma i Sverige vet om det. Eh, och när vi kommer dit till hotellrummet så säger jag bara till Tore då, som han heter. Alltså du får sticka iväg och hitta en champagne. Ja, jag fixar en liten, säger han. Nej, du får fixa en stor, så för det kommer folk. Vadå för några? Jag vet inte, så jag. Och så gick vi till kyrkan då och skulle genomföra det här. Ja, då sitter det två före detta klasskamrater då från Sigtuna. Och sitter där i Norska kyrkan i San Pedro och läser Aftonbladet. Och sen är de ju med på vigseln då. Men hur jag kände att det var så. Jag kände det så tydligt och mycket sådana där saker pågick ett tag för mig. Men s- s- som jag kan se så mycket som har hänt så ser jag att det har haft. Alltså det är ju därför jag är här nu, idag. Alla de här mötena och ja. Det är därför jag sitter här idag. Ja.
Jag tänker det att var och en har sin unika väg hem. Men upplevelsen är likadan. Och det är det vi ser här. Vi ser Helens upplevelse, din upplevelse, min upplevelse. Upplevelserna är likadan fast det är olika symboler.
Mm. Ja, och så är det hela vägen. Alltid när någon berättar stories hit och dit så här så hör jag liksom samma sak.
Ja,
Jag hör samma sak. Ibland känns det, åh nej, det där har jag hört förut. Nej då, men ja, jag hör samma story som min egen.
mm.
Det ser jag nog på. Ja, intressant. Ska vi
Ska vi
fortsätta
ta den här också? Vi ska se hur lång den är. Den är ganska lång. Vi kanske tar den.
nästa gång?
Vi tar den nästa gång.
Ja, kan man också säga.
Jag ska markera den här då. Så, highlight.
Just det, jag har haft en sån här knepigt i, alltså nu jag vet inte dagarna, men jag förlorade alltså ett helt dygn här nu för då i måndags, tisdags någonstans där. Vi skulle ju ha, eller ni hade ju, de,
För att starta föreningen.
ja,
Ja,
och jag var ju helt medveten om det till 12-slagen någonstans på dagen där. Där sen försvinner det.
ja.
Så det hela dygnet. För till Björne säger jag bara liksom, men herregud det är ju söndag idag, säger jag. Söndag idag, säger han, tittar på mig. Ja, det är söndag idag och då var det onsdag.
Ja,
Och det var bara borta, alltså bara borta.
ja.
Det var ganska häftigt faktiskt. Men, ja, skön
Det
upplevelse.
mötet är inspelat i alla fall så du kan se det i efterhand.
Aha.
Du har inte missat någonting så det
Nej,
ligger, det
nej,
ligger i
men
WhatsApp-gruppen.
ja, det såg jag. Ja.
Men
Jag
du,
ska,
då kollar vi om vi har fått något bönesvar. Min bön är att bara få tänka mig i helig ande. Och svaret kommer ju egentligen i den dialog vi har efteråt här, att det är olika eh, symboler, men upplevelsen är densamma i uppvaknandet. Jag är ju i uppvaknandet.
ja.
Jag har ju varit i uppvaknandet hela tiden. Ja,
Mm. Hela livet. Eller
så,
ja, hela livet.
ja,
Inte, alltså inte den här tiden, den här kroppen här nu, men hela livet.
ja. Fick du något bönesvar?
Ja, låt mig se alla ting som de är tillsammans med Helge. Och det var precis vad jag fick. Ja, exakt. Smart. Pang på rödbetan. Mm.
Så är det.
Skönt.
Toppen. Tusen tack. Och jag tror att jag kan läsa nästa torsdag. Vi ska se. Jo då, det kan jag.
Ja, det
Det går
känner
bra.
jag. Och där. Jag tänkte, nu var jag inne på följeslagen. Möte där med. Det var den 26. Det hade jag.
Precis.
Det hade jag. Och sen den 27, 28, då är ju nästa grej.
Ja, då är det träningslägret. Precis.
Yes,
Då är det tacksamhet.
häftigt.
Mm.
Ja, skönt. Ja,
Tusen tack för ikväll.
tack själv.
Imorgon om du vill.
Det gör vi.
Hej hej.
Hej.